Hello and welcome to this week's YouTube video. This video is video number 3 in my series on portrait painting, in which I show you how I have painted this self-portrait plus my dog Fin. The other 2 videos are available to watch on my YouTube channel. So just a quick recap, this video will be showing you the second and final layer of this painting. I will be using the Zorn palette, and you can find the exact colours and brands in the item description. So let's get painting. There will be times when I go silent in this video, as talking for over an hour is quite hard to do. So please don't adjust your volume, I'm just not speaking. So I think this is actually a very interesting part of the painting to see. I would consider it is where the hard work is done, but visually it seems as though the painting doesn't change as much as it does in the underpainting and also layer 1 of the overpainting. But it is where the important decisions are made about how much to tighten and refine, which parts to leave, and it is also the point where it is very easy to lose the painting through overcompensating on what you think you see versus what you actually see. This is because it is easy to fall into the trap of painting detail and losing sight of what my intention was for this painting in the first place. So just to recap, I wanted to paint the emotional connection between myself and Fin. So every decision I now make about this painting should be with that in mind. I just want to talk a little bit about my thought process after the previous video that I posted last week. It is very important to step away from a painting. I find after staring at it for too long, I completely lose my objectivity. And at that point, everything looks terrible. So I stop, I photograph what I've done, and usually have a couple of days away to mull it over in my head. During this time, I will view my photograph that I've taken of my artwork against the reference photo. I will bring them up on my laptop and look at them pretty small side by side, so no more than maybe 3 by 2 inches in size. By viewing them on a small screen in this way, it helps me see where I am out, so I can see where my drawing is out. I can also see where my values are out. But there is a caveat to this though. I have to bear in mind, firstly, that my camera phone will not take an accurate photo. It cannot see the darks or the lights correctly. It will also oversaturate and oversharpen. Viewing the photos small will help alleviate some of the issues with oversaturation and oversharpening. Secondly, my painting is an interpretation of the photo, not an exact copy. So for example, here I have reduced my values on the leg and stomach in comparison to the photo, as I want my lightest lights to be on Fin's face. So using my lightest value here will help direct the viewer to where I want them to look. So I need to be aware of these issues when viewing my photos on my small screen. And by using this exercise to help me view my artwork in a slightly different way, It helps me make a bit of a plan for my second layer. I arrive at the easel knowing what it is I need to do. Well, to start with anyway. My paint is thicker on the second layer, but it's still not majorly thick. I am naturally a thin painter. I am also using a bit of linseed oil on this layer too. Not loads, just a little to make my paint more pliable. In fact, the way I use the linseed oil can vary as it depends how transparent I want the paint to be in the area where I am laying it. Because it doesn't always follow that everything I lay on this layer is automatically thicker. There are areas in the painting where I want it to feel transparent. For example, Finfin's lovely leg hair allows the light to pass through in places. His hair in this area is not a solid object, so I am using the paint in a transparent way. I want subsequent layers to show through, and I don't want great big clumps of thick white paint if I am trying to paint an area that is essentially translucent. So this is where I might load up my linseed oil for that particular section. Remember the rule, fat over lean. My painting is fatter because the linseed oil is ensuring this, but it is still transparent, which is what I want. A word of caution though, leave these areas until near the end. Loading up on linseed oil will make your painting slippery and losing control is quite possible. By leaving it until the end before I tackle these areas, I make it less likely to happen. But if you do get a bit overzealous with the linseed oil in a section of your painting, my best advice is don't try to correct it, just scrape the area off and have another go. Again, this will make it less likely that you lose control of your painting. For the self-portrait, I am leaning much heavier on cadmium red for my colour mixing. If you have never used the Zorn palette before, I would thoroughly recommend it for portrait painting. I think the Zorn palette makes it very hard to go wrong, as you've only got 4 choices, and 2 of those, which are black and white, will either lighten or darken your colour mix, and both black and white will cool down your colour mix as well. So that only leaves you with the option of red or yellow to warm up. Cadmium red is your warmest colour. Yellow ochre is a muted, cooler yellow, so that limits your choice even more. Don't forget also that ivory black has a strong leaning towards blue, so mixing your ivory black with yellow ochre will give you a very muted green, which is great for skin colours. I think by using Zorn, you'll avoid the temptation of oversaturating your skin colours, and it will also give you a much more realistic range of skin tones. In this photograph, my light is cool, so my shadows will be warm. Remember the rule, warm light equals cool shadows, cool light equals warm shadows. So that means in my self-portrait, the areas in the shadows will carry a lot of cadmium red or yellow ochre, or perhaps some combination of the two, plus black to darken my mix. Also, don't forget that yellow ochre can be used to lighten your mix. I don't always want to reach for white to lighten. There are other ways of doing this. Plus, if I use white in my dark shadow areas, it will cool down my mix. This is not what I want because my shadows are warm. So I'm using yellow ochre a lot to lighten the areas in the shadow sections where I am painting myself. I am using Rembrandt Yellow Ochre Light. This is a really great brand for this colour. I find the consistency very buttery and it really is a great colour for lightening up your darks if you want to keep them warm. I just want to talk a little bit now about the colour palette I'm using to paint Fin Fin. Fin Fin is a great example of a white object which is very tricky. The value range in the white areas of his fur go from probably about 9, 10 being the darkest, to maybe a 1 or perhaps a 2. Remembering the rule, cool light equals warm shadows, so his shadows will be warm. Not only that, I also have to contend with the transparency in some areas of his fur where the light passes through it. Then the areas where the fur is very short, around his eyes and nose, and you can see the pinkness of his skin. So there is a lot of colour in Fin Fin, a lot of temperature shifts and a big value range. Not only that, but I also have his fur texture to contend with, which is challenging enough in itself. So there is a lot for me to get wrong. He is not an easy dog to paint, which is why I'm having to take my time. I am constantly stepping back and trying to compare the painting to the reference photo that I have printed out. I have printed it the same size as the painting, and I stick the reference photo to the wall, and I sort of lean the painting against the top of the radiator so that they are both equal heights and next to each other. I then try and get at least 5 meters between myself and what I am viewing. Comparing them side by side helps me see where I am out. For the self-portrait, I used a palette that lent more heavily on cadmium red. For painting Fin, I am using a palette that leans more heavily on yellow ochre. For his really dark areas, I am mixing ivory black with yellow ochre light. I'm finding that if I keep the mixture about 2-to-1 in favour of yellow ochre light, I don't need to add too much white to this mix. It is light enough for those really dark areas, but also warm enough because once you start adding white to this mix, it really begins to shift to a cooler temperature. For his pink areas around his eyes and nose, this is actually a mixture of both cadmium red and yellow ochre light to give me more of an orange. Plus, I also add a trace of black and a bit of white. I always tend to add the white last to my mix, as I find even with zinc titanium white that I use, which is pretty transparent, it has a tendency to overpower and knock out all my colour. So I want to use it as sparingly as possible and tend to add it last. If I can get away with mixing the colour without it, I will, but that's not always possible. You hear about artists not liking black and not using this colour. I seem to have a whiter version, so I use it very sparingly and will always try and lighten with yellow ochre light if I can, especially in the dark and mid-tone areas. I thought I'd also mention that there is no instance in painting Fin where I use just black and white for my midtones or my light areas. It is always a combination of black, white, yellow, or black, white, red, or black, white, yellow and red. Obviously, the quantities of each colour differ depending upon what I am trying to achieve. So a cooler area will lean more heavily on white or black, but there will always be a trace of either red or yellow or both. And the warmer areas will lean more heavily on red or yellow or a combination of the two, with a trace of perhaps black or white. It is also very hard to see the colour in the shades of white, grey, blacks, etc. on your reference photo. I would recommend holding a mid-grey card up to the area that you are trying to paint. For example, I did this for Fin's stomach area. It was difficult to see the colour shifts, and this helped me then decide if the area was more red, yellow or blue. Blue in this instance is my ivory black. So holding a mid-grey card up to your reference photo is a really good trick for helping you to see colour. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about painting the lightest parts of Finfin's fur across his stomach and his leg. As the light passes through the fur on his leg, we can see the shadow created by his solid limb. Under his arm, the area is leaning more heavily to a red-grey, and as I travel up his leg, this area leans more heavily to a yellow-grey and then an orange-grey. The lighter areas carry more white, but there is still a trace of black, yellow and red in this mix. But this area is very hard to paint because it has to blend into the shadowed areas, but I am using thicker paint to lighten up the fur. So this is where it's all likely to start going wrong, and I possibly could run into trouble. The white paint can end up being cakey, chalky, and finding its way into areas where it shouldn't be, simply because I am trying to blend it into the rest of his fur. I do not want hard edges because hard edges will distract my eye instantly to these areas, and I want the viewer to look at Finfin's face. So the reality then of painting this area successfully is a bit of a combination of practice and using the right tools. And I should say that I don't always get it right. I really don't. To make my life easier, I am using zinc titanium white, which has a buttery transparent quality about it. It does not have the same consistency of titanium white, which is much more opaque. I am also using my long-haired brush by Rosemary & Co. This brush allows me to drag wet on wet paint and keep layering paint on top of each other. Because of its long hair, it doesn't pull the previous layer off like a shorter, flatter-haired brush. This brush also allows me to be very expressive with my strokes. I can roll it, dab it, pull it, flick it. It's very good for animal fur. I am also using linseed oil to make my white paint even more transparent, but notice how I have left the whitest areas until the very end. As I said earlier, this helps reduce the likelihood of me getting into trouble and losing control of my painting. Also, if you have any old brushes kicking about, this is the time to use them, as those splayed hairs that make precision painting very hard are great for blending thick paint into the areas around it. I always keep hold of these brushes for this reason. However, I would say that I'm not pulling the white paint into the darker areas and using this transition as my midtones. I have basically laid my dark tone, mid-tone, lighter mid-tones, and now my lightest tones. And I am blending my lightest tones into my lighter mid-tones. If you try to blend from lightest into, say, darkest tone or even mid-tones, you'll find this will make your painting chalky. You need to bridge up to that lightest tone. And this is why Fin is so hard, because I am having to bridge from dark all the way up to light and get all my colour hues and temperatures correct along the way. And then grapple with my thickest paint, but try not to let it overpower my other areas. It really is a bit of a nightmare to paint, to be honest. And so practice does play a big part in being able to do it. I would not have been able to do this 2-3 years ago. I just didn't have enough practice in me to do it. Also, not every stroke I lay is correct. At times, I have laid too much white paint, too much linseed oil, and it has been a fine line between losing it and getting it. And at points, I have had to be satisfied that it is as close as I think I can get it, because I know from experience to continue to fiddle and keep pushing it will result in me losing it again. So very often I will leave an area knowing that it is not 100% where I want it to be, but it is the best I think I can do, because I am trying to paint expressively but be accurate at the same time as well. And sometimes accuracy has to give way to expressiveness. That's just my preference. Another artist may prefer accuracy over expressiveness. Neither way is right and neither way is wrong. It just depends on the individual artist. Just a few tweaks on my face, highlights, and I think that is pretty much it. I think if I fiddle any more, I may lose what I've done. So I am now going to leave it there and call it a day. I hope you have found this 3-part series helpful and you'll be inspired to give the Zorn palette a go. Please like this video if you can and subscribe to my channel where I post videos of my painting process every week. Please also check out my website where you'll find examples of my work and also online lessons and art critiques that I run. Thank you for watching and see you for the next one.